Imagine waking up tomorrow to a presidential decree, not about taxes, not about war, but about your personal savings. Imagine the government demanding you surrender nearly every ounce of gold you own, your coins, your bullion, your certificates, under threat of a $10,000 fine or a decade in prison. This isn't a dystopian novel. This is American history. In 1933, at the height of the Great Depression, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 6102. With a single stroke of the pen, the state legally and forcibly removed the ultimate store of private wealth in the hands of its citizens. But the real mystery isn't that it happened. The mystery is why the government saw gold, the universally recognized symbol of stability and sound money, as the greatest threat to its power. And if they did it once, what are the modern tools the state could use to seize assets today? This is the story of how a seemingly stable financial system was crippled by global crisis, how a president used emergency powers to strip citizens of their assets, and what that forgotten episode tells us about the security of your wealth in the age of digital currency and perpetual crises. To understand the seizure of 1933, we must go back to the golden age that preceded it, the international gold standard. For decades, the gold standard served as the bedrock of global finance. A paper dollar wasn't just a promise. It was a certificate, redeemable for a fixed, reliable amount of gold. This system, while promoting global trade and monetary discipline, had a critical flaw: inflexibility. When the Great Depression began, a crisis rooted in the shockwaves from World War I, stock market chaos, and a devastating global economic downturn, the gold standard became a straitjacket. The system demanded that when a nation's economy contracted, the money supply had to shrink in parallel. For the U.S. in the early 1930s, this meant relentless, crushing deflation. Prices fell, wages fell, and most terrifyingly, the value of debt rose. Banks failed in droves because the assets backing their loans, like houses and farms, were losing value faster than the debts could be paid. President Roosevelt's administration knew they had to break this deflationary spiral. They needed to inject liquidity, support prices, and most importantly, devalue the dollar. But here's the critical twist we must understand. They couldn't devalue the dollar while gold remained in private hands. Why? Because if the government officially reduced the amount of gold backing the dollar, every citizen holding a gold certificate would rush to redeem it before the devaluation took effect. This would drain the Treasury's reserves, rendering any monetary policy change instantly meaningless. The only way out was to eliminate the private right to own gold first. It was a preemptive strike, a forced exchange to pave the way for a radical monetary reboot. The groundwork for the confiscation wasn't laid in a sudden legislative session. It was laid in a climate of escalating fear and the expansion of state authority. The early 1930s saw two major power moves by the state that set the stage. First, the declaration of a national banking holiday in March 1933. This emergency measure closed all banks to prevent total systemic collapse, granting the executive branch sweeping, unprecedented financial control. Second, the psychological campaign against hoarding. The government argued that citizens were holding onto their gold and cash out of irrational fear, preventing the flow of credit necessary for recovery, while millions were hoarding gold, a natural reaction to seeing the fiat system fail. The government reframed this rational financial defense as an unpatriotic act contributing to the nation's decline. This rhetoric shifted the public's perception of gold. It was no longer seen as a prudent investment. It was viewed as a societal burden, a selfish indulgence that prolonged the suffering of the nation. This moral justification was vital, creating the necessary public acquiescence to the final, audacious step. April 5th, 1933. The day the ownership of American wealth changed forever. Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 6102, ominously titled, forbidding the hoarding of gold coin, gold bullion, and gold certificates within the continental United States. The order was simple, chillingly direct, and absolute. It forbade the ownership of more than $100 worth of gold, roughly 5 troy ounces. This exempted only rare coins, jewelry, and gold needed for specific industrial uses. If you owned more, you were now a criminal. The clock was ticking. Citizens were given less than a month, until May 1st, 1933, to turn in their excess gold. They were required to deliver it to any Federal Reserve bank, branch, or agency. But what did they receive in return? A meager $20.67 per troy ounce. This was the legally mandated, pre-existing price. For the citizen, it felt like an expropriation. For the government, it was merely the first necessary move in a two-part play. Crucially, the government provided no compensation for the future devaluation they were planning. Citizens who had held gold to protect themselves from government policy were now forced to surrender it at the pre-crisis price, precisely before the monetary maneuver that would drastically increase gold's value. The moment the government effectively nationalized the nation's gold, the second and most profitable act began. Having removed the risk of a run on its reserves, the Roosevelt administration was free to revalue the dollar. In 1934, the official price of gold was raised from $20.67 to $1.35 per troy ounce. This act was, in effect, a massive, instant devaluation of the dollar by roughly 70%. But because the government now held the nation's gold, they captured the entire, enormous profit. This profit, calculated in the billions, was used to fund the Exchange Stabilization Fund. This fund became a powerful new tool for monetary policy, enabling the government to manipulate currency markets and manage the dollar's value internationally. The government had not only freed itself from the gold standard shackles, but had also financed its own recovery mechanism using the compulsory, low-cost acquisition of private wealth. The confiscation was so thorough that production of gold coins ceased entirely. The famous 1933 double eagle coins, struck but never officially circulated, were ordered destroyed. Only a handful escaped, leading to one coin selling for over $7.5 million in 2002, a haunting testament to the wealth that was lost and the power the state asserted. And what about the legal challenges? They were numerous. But as a historical reference point, not one of those lawsuits against the government was ever decided in the plaintiff's favor. The government's assertion of emergency power was upheld. This prohibition remained largely in place for over 4 decades, only being suspended in 1976. The story of Executive Order 6102 is often dismissed as a relic of the Great Depression, a historical curiosity. But the mechanism of financial control, the assertion of emergency power, and the willingness of the state to forcibly seize assets during a crisis is not a relic. It is a repeating pattern. We see this pattern in history. The invalidation of gold clauses during the War of 1812 and the Civil War. More recently, the Cuban government's nationalization of U.S.-owned property during its revolution, described as the largest uncompensated taking of American property by a foreign government in history. But the real modern parallel lies in the tools now at the state's disposal. If the Great Depression's tool was physical gold confiscation, the modern equivalent is the implementation of capital controls. These are measures, often pitched as means to restore stability and confidence, designed to restrict the flow of capital and isolate private wealth for potential confiscation or devaluation. Historically, capital controls are often a precursor to something far worse, such as currency devaluation or a bank bail-in. And perhaps the most pertinent parallel, digital assets. Gold was a physical asset that required enforcement to seize. But modern digital assets are, by design, traceable and subject to centralized control. The establishment of state-managed digital asset reserves, such as a strategic Bitcoin reserve, highlights the policy framework being laid to manage and, if necessary, control digital wealth. The state is always seeking the next mechanism to assert financial sovereignty. The shadow of the state reveals 3 enduring lessons about the relationship between government power and private wealth. Sovereignty over property. In a systemic crisis, the state's need for monetary flexibility will always trump the citizen's right to property. When push comes to shove, the ultimate financial sovereign is the government. The threat of sound money. Gold was targeted precisely because it maintained its value when fiat currency failed. Any asset that functions as a stable alternative to the national currency, whether physical or digital, is a potential target for control or confiscation during a crisis. Preparedness is preemptive. When capital controls or emergency measures are first implemented, it is often already too late to prepare. Financial history consistently shows that protection must be secured before the initial crisis measures are implemented. The question is no longer if governments will assert extreme financial control, but when and through which vector they will choose to do it next. The warning is simple. They did it once. What is the modern equivalent of the gold certificate you hold today?